All right guys, so this is part 3 in our video series on how to make a board bow. In this video we're going to continue on where we left off last time. So if you'll recall, in part 2 we went ahead and got the bow floor tillered, and then we applied our rawhide backing, and then we had to set this thing aside to dry for a couple of days. Well, it's been a couple of days, the rawhide is dry, so we're going to go ahead and remove these pants legs here that we were holding the rawhide down with. And then we're going to take it off this form, and we're going to go ahead and trim the rawhide to fit the back of the bow, and then we can continue on with the tillering process. Now at the end of this video, we're going to finish this bow off. We're going to shoot it through the chronograph to see how fast it shoots. So let's get started here. See what we got. This is almost like Christmas, unwrapping a present. Now you can see we've got a little bit of back set that's in this bow. Now through the tillering process, we're going to lose most, if not all of that, but it'll still help us to avoid string follow or set. And string follow or set basically is when you unstring the bow, it tends to stay bent. That is not good. All right, so we're going to trim this up with our rasp, the fine side of our rasp. And I'm going to take the fine side of this rasp, and I'm going to rasp from the back down towards the belly with just a little slight angle. And that's going to cut through this rawhide, take just a little bit of this wood off, and that's going to trim this perfectly to fit right perfectly on the back of this bow. So we've got this bow all trimmed up. The rawhide is fitting perfectly to the back. I do have just a little piece right there that didn't glue down, but we'll just throw a little bit of glue under there and clamp it down. Let that dry. All right, so I went ahead and glued down the little tag in here that didn't sit down there good enough to begin with. Everything's dry. And now we're going to start in on the tillering process. Now in the last video we had already kind of started that a little bit, but we have a long way to go. And so what I'm doing is I'm just kind of looking at the tiller. I can tell that this limb here is a little bit stiffer than this limb. And so the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to start on this limb with our hand plane, and I'm just going to start taking, probably take maybe 8 or 10 strokes with the hand plane off of that, and then test that tiller again. And again, how many of these strokes you take off is really going to depend on how aggressive you got your plane set. You know, you may only need to take off 3 or 4. Yeah, that made a big difference. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put this thing on the tillering block here. So if you don't have a tillering string, what I normally do is just make a string out of B50 or Fast Flight or whatever kind of string material you have, and then just make it long and only tie a knock loop into one end. And I've got a video on how I do that. And I basically just use that string as my tillering string and put a timber hitch in one end. But to do it that way, you have to have your knocks cut in, which I'll show you how to do that here in just a little bit. So go ahead and put it up on your tillering rack here. And if you need to know how to build something like this, I've also got a video showing how I do this. And then I also cover it in my book, the Traditional Bowyer's Handbook, which you can get on my website. So put it in your tillering rack and just come back and give it a little pull. You don't want to pull it down too far. Just give it a little pull just so you can see how it's bending. Now, you can see we're getting a lot of bend from right in the middle. You can see that the left-hand limb is bending just a little bit more than the limb on the right. Just ever so slightly. And if you look right here, that's where we're getting most of the bend on this side. This limb here is pretty stiff. We're gonna have to take a lot of wood off of that one. All right, so what I generally tell beginners to do is mark where the weak spots are. So we know we have a weak spot right here. So I'm just going to mark that so that I'll know when I put it into my vise, I'll know that we don't need to take as much wood off of here. Normally what I do is I take wood off of the stiffer spots until they match the weaker spots, and I leave the weak spots alone until we've got that arc even across the bow. Now it still may be very heavy, but I want to even it up before we start taking wood off the weaker spots. Otherwise we could create a hinge. I'm going to put this thing back in our vise and continue to take wood off of those stiff areas. So I took 8 strokes off of that. Now here is our weaker spot. I'm going to avoid that for right now. Got some glue on there. Now, when you're taking wood off these limbs, whether you're doing it with a block plane or a scraper or a draw knife or whatever, you don't want to come and start, let's say we have a stiff spot, you know, right here. You don't want to start at the same spot every single time, because what that's going to cause is it's going to cause a step down in the thickness of the wood. We don't want that. We want a nice, smooth transition from the handle all the way down to the limb tips. And so you may need to go into that area that's a little bit weak, just a little bit, just to fade it in. All right, let's see what that did. The entire tillering process is something that needs to go slowly. You need to check how these limbs are bending often, because it can be very easy to overshoot the amount of wood that you want to take off. And if you do that, you're going to end up with a bow that's lighter than you want. And so if you take your time and check how these limbs are bending, every time you take wood off, you can avoid taking too much wood off. So again, that right-hand limb is still pretty stiff. The left-hand limb is bending a little better. So it's fairly stiff right through here. So I'm going to take, I don't know, 4 or 5 passes off of this limb just right here in the middle and see if that makes any difference. Yeah, you can see it's not really noticeable, but you can see that it's bending a little bit more. If you're shooting for a 40-pound bow or a 50-pound bow, you don't want to put more than that amount of pressure on it. Because what's going to happen, let's say we're shooting for a 50-pound bow, and we will shoot for something right around there. Let's say we're shooting for a 50-pound bow, and when we're drawing on it with this, the rope here, and it's in the tillering rack, let's say we put 70 pounds of weight on it. All that's doing is putting more stress on the belly side of this bow and compressing all that wood on the belly. Now what that's going to cause is excessive string follow. And as we've said in previous videos, string follow is the tendency of a bow to stay bent when it's unstrung. And that's all due to compressing that wood on the belly, which we want to avoid. Now, I can do it by feel because I've built hundreds of bows. But if you don't have a good feel for it, you can take a bow, if you already have a bow of your desired draw weight, you can take that bow, put it in your tillering rack and pull it just to see what it feels like drawing it through the tillering rack. Or you can put a bow scale in between your pull rope and your tillering string here. That works really well so that you can see exactly how much weight you're putting on that string. So again, I'm just going to take off a little bit more and then put it back on the rack and check it again. Now, we're starting to flatten this belly out a little bit. We don't want a real crowned out belly. And so through the tillering process, I'm going to start taking that crown off a little bit. So I'm going to quit rolling my plane over quite so much and mainly just keep it right on top here. That's looking pretty good there. Nice even tiller from side to side. Both limbs are bending on a nice arc. They're both pretty even. My left-hand limb is a little stiff, kind of right towards the middle. So right in here, it's just a little bit stiff. So I'm going to focus my wood removal right in there. But overall, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to take a little bit more off of right here. So I'm going to take wood off the whole thing, but I'm going to take an extra scrape or two from right in here. I'm drawing it far enough now. That would probably be about where the bow would be braced. So we're going to go ahead and round these tips off a little bit and cut our string grooves in there, and then we'll go ahead and just put a short string on it. Where I want my string grooves to go, and I just do about a 45-degree angle. So I start that off with just that little carbide blade that I've got on the hacksaw, and then I'll finish it off with a 1/8" chainsaw file. All right, let's see if we can get the string on this thing. Yeah. When you first string it, it'll be a little difficult, but for first stringing, that's not too bad. It's when you first put the strings on these bows, it's really common to have one limb that's stiff and one limb that's weak. But this one came out pretty even. That's looking pretty good. It's heavy. You know, I'm aiming for about 50 pounds, and I'm hitting 50 pounds right about there. So I don't want to draw it any farther than that. Now during the final stages of tillering, I usually just leave the bow strung. Saves time. There's no need to unstring it, as long as you don't nick your string with your scraping tool. I'm just going to use a pocket knife. Now, one peculiarity of wood bows is that, and I've never built a fiberglass bow, so I don't know if this applies to them or not, but wood has a type of memory. And if I take wood off of here and then just look at the tiller, the way it's sitting here, you're not going to see any difference. You have to draw this thing. You have to stress those limbs so that you get rid of that memory and the wood can settle into its new bend. So after I take off wood like that, you know, you can't just sit here and look at the bow and say, oh, well, it looks the same, and continue to take off wood. If you do that, you're going to end up with making the stiff limb into the weak limb. And so after you take off wood, always draw it a little bit. Get rid of that memory. So I can tell, you know, just drawing it like this, you know, that's way heavier than I want it to be. So we're going to continue to take wood off. I'm just going to put it right back here in the tillering rack. See what she looks like. That's looking better. Still heavy, which is good. We want to approach that final draw weight slowly. Looks like that right limb is maybe a wee bit stiffer now. And you can see how thin these little shavings are that I'm taking off, but that'll change how these limbs are bending. So as these limbs, as you take wood off of these limbs and these limbs get thinner and thinner, the thinner they are, the more each little bit of wood that you take off counts. So basically, as we approach our final tiller, you can make a big difference in how those limbs bend by just taking off, 8 or 10 scrapes with a pocket knife, or sometimes even 3 or 4 scrapes. So again, the closer you get to final tiller and final weight, the more you need to go back to your rack and pull it and check how those limbs are bending and check the weight of them. just looking at this bow, it looks like the distance from here to here is a little greater than from here to here. Grab my bow square and just look at that. Yeah. So we need to, if you can see that, we need to round this limb out a little bit to match this one. This limb's a little stiff, and I think it's stiff in towards the handle. Let's take a look at it. So right here, if you look closely, you'll see that we're getting quite a bit of bend kind of right in there. Now if I kept, we've still got some wood to take off, it's still kind of heavy, and so we're fine. But if I continued to take wood off of this whole limb, including this spot, this would end up as a hinge or an angled spot where this part of the limb is doing more work than the rest of the limb. And to have a bow that's efficient and that lasts the test of time, you need something that where all parts of the limb are doing an equal amount of work. And so if we made a bow with a hinge right here, or a slight hinge, every time the bow is shot, the hinged area would be doing more work than the rest of the limb, and it would eventually become, the rest of the bow would overpower it, and that hinge would just get worse and worse over time until eventually the bow either broke or performed very poorly. Sometimes with woods like hickory, you can get away with making a bow with a hinge, but they don't shoot very well in general. So I'm going to take some wood off of right in here, and then also a little bit right in here, so that we can match this weaker area. So I'm going to take some from right in here. So when you're working these limbs down, you want to just do it a little at a time. You don't want to just jerk it right on down to, 28 inches or whatever your draw length is. So that next line down is 28, and we just hit it right there. My draw length is 29, so I'm going to go on down. I always take my bows down a little farther than what I'm going to be expecting to draw, just to be on the safe side. So that's about 29.5 or so. And our tiller looks pretty good. I think we're finished. Yeah, that feels good. Tiller looks good. Let's go shoot this thing, see what it does. All right, so we've got this bow all finished up, and I've got my chronograph set up, and the chronograph just measures the speed of an object, whether it's a bullet or an arrow or whatever. And so we're gonna shoot the bow through here and just see what it does and how it compares to some of my other bows. All right, so we're shooting just under 140 feet per second, which isn't great, but for a bow that came from Home Depot and cost a couple of bucks to make, that's really not bad. The bows that I normally make, the Osage bows that I normally make, usually have quite a bit of reflex in the limb tips, which can really speed them up. And I'm usually getting around 155 to 170 feet per second out of those bows. So there's a couple of things that we can do to this bow that we made to speed that thing up, and we're going to cover that in a future video. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, do that so that you don't miss out on those new videos when they come out.
And then if you have any questions at all about anything that you saw in this video series, go ahead and leave us a comment and I'll try to answer as many of those questions as I can. And then also, if you want to see more of this type of content, give us a thumbs up. That'll help me to understand what you guys want. Or if you have suggestions for other videos, leave that in the comment as well. And so with that, we'll see you next time.